Hello, my name is Erwin Ironstone, and I'm here today to talk about several quick topics. The first one is the treaty that President Obama rejected with his veto, and that's fine. And what's interesting is that the House and the Senate will probably approve that treaty. And it's related to being able to go after Saudi Arabia for supporting terrorists. Now, there's basically a law in the United States called the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. And there was a case called Nelson versus Saudi Arabia that the Supreme Court found, with the backing of the State Department, that you couldn't sue Saudi Arabia, a Saudi Arabia hospital, because it was part of the state. Now, what happened in that case, and I had an opportunity to speak to Judge Edward D. Ray, who was the first Chief Justice of the Court of International Trade. And in speaking with him, I found out that he had written the lower court opinion, which was in the Ninth Circuit. And the reason that happened is he was a visiting judge who sat on the appellate panel, who wrote the decision in favor of Nelson. After speaking with him, I learned that there are a lot of things that never came out in the Supreme Court decision. Number one, Nelson was hired as an engineer to overlook the hospital. Nelson actually was able to see bribes and kickbacks on the hospital staff, and when he reported it to his supervisor and superior, he was arrested, and it led to torture, and it led to a lot of other things. And finally he was released by the Saudis, and that was a diplomatic, quote, solution. However, when he came back here to sue, he wasn't allowed to sue because evidently it didn't meet the state exception, because in Saudi Arabia, hospitals were in fact state hospitals. However, at that point, I believe Judge Ray was talking about a terrorist exception, and in this case, it probably would have been relevant, and it would have been relevant because the Saudis, basically in the hospital, abused him, tortured him in a prison. When his wife begged the State Department to help, they said, "We can't do that. Saudis are, our allies." So when she flew into Saudi Arabia to see if she can do anything, the Saudis offered to have sex with her, and for whatever reason, the diplomats did in fact get Nelson back here. And when it was tried, the case was tried, the federal appellate, the Ninth Circuit, found that there was reason to hold the Saudis accountable. The Supreme Court, with lots of pressure from the State Department, the same quote, and it happened in the 90s, so it's not a recent case. It happened in, I think, 1993 or 1996, and the case is Nelson versus Saudi Arabia. And the more I look at it, we as a nation have favored Saudi Arabia because of the oil and their help in the Middle East in many ways. The question, though, is who should we hold accountable when Americans are tortured overseas, when terrorists train in Saudi Arabia and then come here and blow up the Twin Trade Towers? And what I like about this situation, surprisingly, is finally, both the Republicans and the Democrats are getting together to say, yes, you can sue. And that's being added effectively as a separate law that Obama is trying to knock out, probably because he's afraid Americans will be sued in other countries. I don't know how that's going to play out, but as far as I see it, American companies and Americans who've been abusive in foreign countries shouldn't have the immunity. And I was thinking of one in South America where an oil company recently had a judgment overturned, possibly because the form that it was taken in. But the issue is, Judge Ray explained, and he had literally books, and he said he had stacks of paper showing that the Saudis were abusive, not only to Nelson, but in the general society. And I think that's something we have to look at, and sometimes the State Department and the President should in fact be overridden. In this case, we as a country didn't help the people from 9/11, so they took the action to court, and they took it to the political arm, which is the Senate and also the House, and they passed it. It's going to come back because they now, I think, need a 3/4 vote in order to override the president. But that's one nice thing that's happened, and I sort of am glad that it's happening on Obama's watch, because basically it's the first time we had the two parties, both Republicans and Democrats, agreeing to try to help the victims of 9/11. And what's interesting here is Schumer, who will most likely be either the minority or the presiding person of the Senate, majority in the Senate if the Democrats win the Senate, but if they don't win it, he'll be the minority whip in the Senate, because the current Democrat who's highest in the chain in the Senate is retiring, and Schumer is from New York, so I guess he didn't quite follow the Obama political line and said, I have lots of people and lots of votes, and that has precedence to me. But finally, the two parties are agreeing on something, and we should probably take a look at the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act to see whether that's going to be impacted, because at one point there was talk. In fact, there are, I think, 7 countries who were basically exempt because of terrorist exceptions from the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. And maybe in this case, where Saudi Arabia allowed these terrorists to originate, to plan their attack on the World Trade Center, should be recognized as someone who supported terror. I think by extension, the next thing to do is to look at what happens with Iran, because Iran is probably the largest single country who supports terrorism all over the world. And Iran has done that by supporting ISIS. They have supported the opposition in the Syrian war. They have helped ISIS take control of large parts of Syria. They've supported arms to those who have attacked civilians in Israel. They've helped destabilize the government in Iraq, and Obama just made a treaty with Iran over nuclear arms. I certainly hope that the treaty holds, but somehow I don't trust the Ayatollahs, because in the past we've had to bribe and ransom and do anything we can to get people free from the Iranian government. Okay, that's the end of this segment. Thank you.